Are migrants who commit crime sufficiently punished in Western Europe?
Well, it's not up to me to say. It's up to the specific national state. So every national state has its own tradition when it gets to the laws and the punishments.
I'm not sure that's true, though.
Well, I would say.
What about the grooming gangs in England? They got off because they were dark and Muslim.
Well, this is also an interesting question. So you can frame the grooming gang in the UK as Muslim grooming gang if you want to frame the whole issue in a religious frame.
Or a racial frame is the way they framed it.
Well, actually, if you take a look, some of the grooming gangs were run by Sikh people.
Sikhs?
Yeah.
Sikhs.
And also, if you take a look on the construction of this grooming gang, you see that, for example, there was one taxi company operated by a Sikh guy who were employing people from the Indian subcontinent, not only from Pakistan or India, Bangladesh, from all around. So it certainly was a specific social group, but I won't say like a Muslim grooming gang, because these people were basically not following the principles of Islam when it gets to alcohol consumption, drug consumption, or any other issues. So of course they were culturally Muslim people. They were Muslim people from countries of Muslim majorities, but framing this as a Muslim issue, I think it's probably, I would say, it's the political correct way of the right to frame the issue.
Okay. What would be the best label to categorize these individuals? All of them. What would be the best label we could use?
Again, it's a complicated question because of specific traditions in specific countries. In the UK, it's okay to label them by ethnicity or racial background, because if you applied for a job, you can X which racial background you're from. In France, that's more problematic.
Yeah, like the grooming gangs. What would be the best label of, like, how would we categorize the people engaged in this behavior? What would be the best label we could use?
I think that should give us courage, exposure to other people's perspectives.
It's moving us in a good direction.
Omar, talk to me about migration in Europe.
Well, it's a very complicated question if we want to go beyond the political slogans, either of the left and the right. So we have basically a challenge in Europe. So there are regions around like North Africa, Middle East, Sub-Saharan Africa, where young generational people are desperate. And basically you see that in specific countries, like 20%, 30% of the young people are employed. They cannot get married, because in most of the Muslim countries and Arab countries, if you want to get married, you have to provide something for your bride and the bride's family. So a lot of people have to wait until to reach the age of 35, 40, and they are desperate to make a better life. So according to the Arab Barometer, which came out this year, we see that in some countries, like in Tunisia, for example, 73% of the young people want to migrate from their country.
73% of people
73, yes.
Of young people in Tunisia.
Yes. This doesn't mean that they will necessarily do the first step to do so, but there is a very strong desire in society.
I'm sorry. I just want to make sure I understand. When you say 73% of young people in Tunisia want to migrate, you're talking, do they want to migrate to Libya? They want to migrate to, you're laughing, but I just want to be, where do they want to migrate to? Western Europe?
Well,
Eastern Europe?
Europe is definitely a top destination. For the most educated one, of course, the Arab Gulf is an obvious choice, because the language is similar, the culture is very similar, and there are good salaries there. But for those who don't have professions which they can use in the market, they obviously choose Europe. And of course, there's a huge employment among young graduates at the universities. So especially those who graduated in humanities or other studies, well, they don't have to go, but going to Europe is an obvious choice.
And so the people who come here, the young people, are they primarily male? Are they primarily skilled? Are they unskilled? What's the demographic? And
Actually,
what do you mean?
depends
By here, I mean Western Europe.
It depends on the country. Certainly, if we get to countries like Syria, torn by civil war, and the consequences of civil war, like poverty, like 90% of the Syrians are suffering to buy food every month. That's 90%. A very different 90%. So this is basically a very different demographic than those in Tunisia or Morocco. So it's very hard to generalize.
And that's interesting. It may be hard to generalize, but the data that I've seen, and I am no expert in this at all, The data that I've seen is that it's overwhelmingly young and male.
Yeah, that's true. So basically, it's not only an individual choice in many societies or countries. It's a choice of the whole family or the whole community. So it's not only the male who gathers his money or saves his money to pay for the smugglers. These are usually whole families and communities who support them because once the young male, as you mentioned, arrives to Europe, he is expected by the family to provide them and send them money so the family can live.
Is smuggling like is it required? I mean, can't you just get on a boat? I've been reading Matt Goodwin's Substack and the way that I mean, again, this is outside my area of expertise, but was it like 193 people a day last time I looked come over to the UK on boats? Just boats.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when it gets to the Mediterranean, there are different routes, and most of the routes are used by different nationalities. If we talk about the Balkan route, the Western Balkan route is usually used by Syrians, Afghans, and recently Turks as well. If we talk about the Central Mediterranean route, where it is used obviously for geographical proximity by Tunisians, by Sub-Saharan Africans. If it gets to the Western African route, it's usually used by people of the Sahel region.
And so when these people come, what do they do in general? Like, do they find low-income jobs? Are they baristas? Are they going on unemployment? Do they go on the dole? Do they commit crime? Do they become CEOs of company? Do they marry for? I mean, what in general is the trajectory? Like, spell that out from when they first got off the boat. What do they do? So they're illegal. They go to Western Europe. What do they do?
Yeah, there's a huge gap between the people's image about Europe and the realities of Europe. So those who made their way to Europe usually communicate success through social media. So you see young people are making selfies with fancy cars, going to fancy shops, and showing their community back home that they basically succeeded in Europe. Because failure is a big shame for the individual, and also it can be problematic for the family who provided him financial sources for the travel.
For the smugglers.
Yeah, basically, yes. So the young males who are already in Europe usually communicate success and show for their fellows back home that he succeeded in Europe. However, the reality is much harsher than this because the European societies are not that accepting for newcomers. It's hard to find a good paying job. People, especially who don't have a legal basis to reside, are abused by employers. Sometimes they are not paid. So there's a big stress and a big inner struggle for those who already reached Europe. And everybody tries to make money somehow. Some of them are, well, I would say most of them doing it in the legal way, but some of them are doing it in the illegal way because basically this huge pressure from home to send back money.
So what are people getting wrong about migration on the left and the right? What is the left getting wrong about migration in Europe, and what is the right getting wrong?
There are a lot of things. So first of all, usually the migrants are regarded as.
Let's just to be clear, so I can understand. Tell me first what the left is getting wrong.
The left usually doesn't take into consideration the cultural aspects of migration. The basic fact that if you got people, a huge number of people from collective societies, very different socialization to the Western European countries. And I'm not saying it's better or worse. It's simply different. The family values, the values of the individual, the approach to work, the future, to religion is very different in those countries of origin. And these differences cannot disappear in an overnight, especially not if you have a huge number of people arriving, especially if those are not that much educated people who are not familiar with Western values, Western literature, Western culture. So obviously there will be tensions between the European societies and the immigrant societies. And
the left thought that there wouldn't be.
Yes, that's right. And basically, that's also true that there are communities who are integrated in Europe. And now we can get to what the right gets wrong.
Before we do that, does the left get anything else wrong about migration?
Well, the left usually regards the migrants as victims. So they think that the migrants are victims of the criminal human traffickers. And of course, the human traffickers are criminals. But if you make interviews or read basically the sociological researches about migration, you see that the migrants basically don't regard themselves as victims. They regard themselves as active people who took their fate in their hand. So, and they take the challenge to go to Europe and regard the human smuggler as a potential helper, a partner, a friend. So they don't regard him as somebody who is abusing them. It's an issue of supply and demand.
Okay, so that's what the left gets wrong. What does the right get wrong about migration in Europe?
I believe the right-wing approach to migration and the right-wing narrative is very simplistic in recent years. So in recent years or the last decade, I think there is a very big emphasis on the religious aspect of migration. Meanwhile, the cultural aspect is very much left out. So recently, we are framing the migration as a Muslim issue. However, if you take a look on the numbers, you see that many of those who arrive are basically a non-Muslim background, like Christian sub-Saharans and Christian minorities from the Middle East. And there is a tendency on the right to Islamize the whole discourse and say that it's only an issue of religion. Meanwhile, if we take a closer look on the problems caused by uncontrolled mass migration, we see that most of them are cultural and not only religious.
Excellent. Okay, let's talk about this. Explain what you mean by, like, what's an example of a cultural problem?
For example, in the West, usually there is this approach, which is, well, some foundation of it were put down by Samuel Huntington, and and it was developed by some thinkers, mostly not experts in Middle Eastern studies or Islamic studies, who approach Islam and regard Islam as an ideology, which is like a totalitarian ideology. However, Islam is much more culture. It's a culture and also a religion. So it's very hard to compare like a Bosniak Muslim to a Somali Muslim to Syrian Muslims. If you take a look on a Bosniak Muslim, you see that culturally, which impacts his behavior and values for family and approach to governance and authorities, he's much similar to a Serbian or a Croatian, because they're all people from the Balkan region. If you take a look on a Nigerian Muslim, you see that he has much more connection to a Nigerian Christian, or the Nigerian Christian has much more cultural connection to a Nigerian Muslim than to a fellow Christian in Scandinavia, because basically it's much more about culture. And when it gets to this cultural problems or tensions, we see that it's also a matter of social class. So you cannot say that Muslims are the criminals in Europe. You can see that certain groups of people who arrived from Europe from a lesser educated background can cause trouble. So, for example, if you take a look at the prison statistics in the Netherlands, you see that
I'm only laughing because I literally just looked at those the other day. Go ahead.
Yeah. So you see that those who are overrepresented in prisons are basically the Surinamis, who are not Muslims, mostly not Muslims.
Are basically the who?
The Suriname.
The Suriname.
The Surinamis, who came from Latin America, basically.
The Suriname.
Surinamis, yes.
Really?
And then come the Moroccans. But you cannot find, for example, and the Moroccans are Muslims, but you cannot find the Indonesians in the statistics. However, like hundreds of thousands are Indonesians living in the Netherlands because it was a previous colony of the Netherlands. However, the culture is different.
So the Suriname are from Northeast South America.
Yeah, locked between Guyana, French Guyana, and Brazil. Okay. Small country.
Okay. So they're overrepresented. Who else is overrepresented? Who's underrepresented?
If we talk about the Muslim communities of the Netherlands...
Well, I just meant in general, but that's fine, yeah.
Yeah. So we should mention the Indonesians. And it's a very cultural reason, because North Africa, where the Moroccans hail from, or South America, is a very masculine society, unlike Southeastern Asia. Therefore, like violence or these things is very much not present in Indonesian culture. Therefore, the Indonesian migrants, regardless of their religious affiliation, can fit quite well into society. And I'm not saying that all the Moroccans
No,
are
no, for
outside,
sure.
because of course the intellectual elite of Morocco are residing in Europe. So I don't want to generalize, no way.
So you think that that masculinity is causal to crime?
I would say it's a part of the whole issue, but also it's about like the education, the educational level, and the familiarity with the Western way of life. So there are huge differences between like the Turkish communities of Germany and the Turkish communities of the UK, because they arrived in different waves from different parts of Turkey, different social classes, and there are very different issue.
Does that relate at all to honor versus dignity cultures?
It has something to do with that potentially, yes. So the one's reputation in front of the society, the group, is very important for North African culture in general. It's not only important for the individual; it's important for his whole family and community, because one individual is responsible for the community's honor and the community's reputation in the society and place in society, which affects its economic place and everything, basically.
So when these young men come en masse to Western Europe, and I want to get back to where they're exactly going and where they're from, what happens to all the females, the women, the young girls who are left behind? What happens with them?
Very few of these young male want to stay for good in Europe. Most of them just want to. If we take a look on the polls and statistics and researches done among young males, certainly if somebody has no place to go back, like he's like a second or third generation refugee, Afghani refugee from a Pakistani refugee camp, then there's no place to go back. Or if somebody's country is destroyed in war, there's no place to go back. And of course, he or she, when he arrives to Europe, wants to bring the family along just to have a better life. But when it gets to the young males, they usually just want to make money, stay for a couple of years, make money, go home, have a home, build their own house, and provide his old parents, and so on.
Okay, so the young women remain in the country,
Yeah.
and then the young men. You say that they don't want to stay in Western Europe, but when you look in Western Europe, it's just. I'm trying to say this in a way that's neutral, but it has a large number of people who are not native to the area who have stayed there.
Yeah.
Okay, so is there anything else that the right gets wrong about immigration?
I would say I have to think about it. I didn't think about it that way. What the right gets wrong about migration, because there are very different approaches to migration from very different right-wing parties in Europe. So, and we see recently that it's not only the issue of left and right. So, if the politician wants to be elected and re-elected, he wants to apply to the demands of the people. And we see that recently the issue of mass migration is not a left or right issue. So the country which implemented the harshest integration, even assimilation laws in Europe is Denmark, run by a socialist government. And they frame this anti-migration policies in a very socialist framework. We see that Emmanuel Macron, who is basically a centrist politician, or you can call him a liberal politician, he tried to implement harsher immigration and integration laws than conservative Jacques Chirac before. We see that Chancellor Scholz of Germany is now having a tougher rhetoric on migration that the conservative Angela Merkel did before. If we take a look on Italy, we see that in 2016, when the huge wave of migrants and refugees started to arrive to Italy, it was Mario Minetti, a leftist Minister of Interior, who agreed with Libyan militias to hold the people back by arms. and not let them to cross the Mediterranean, for the very reason that they are monitoring the public opinion, and those who want to be in power or stay in power, they'll have to do something.
Interesting. Okay, so there's obviously a lot to talk about here. What percentage of the immigrants who go to Western Europe are Muslim?
There are no statistics, actually. There are lots of numbers about this issue, but usually there is a bias in the statistics. So usually, just for example, to give you an example, they say the way Muslims are measured. Well, in some countries, there are statistics because you can ask about religion, but you cannot ask about religion like in France, for example. You have to find other ways to find out. So usually, they take a look on the country of origin and say, like, for example, in Iraq, 99% of the Iraqi population are Muslims. Therefore, the governments and those who make the statistics assume that 99% of the migrants will be Muslim. But that's not true. Because, for example, in the case of Sweden, most of the Iraqis who arrived after 2003, the invasion of Iraq, were of Iraqi Assyrian background, Christian people. So it's very hard to say an exact data about the number and percentage of Muslim. However, it's very clear that a huge percent, and more than 60% or 70% are Muslim, given that some countries of origin or the main countries of origin are mainly Muslim countries, speaking about North Africa, the Sahel region.
Now, I realize that there are some problems here. That, for example, I was going to ask about why don't we see many Muslim immigrations in Eastern Europe. I realize Albania is Muslim, and we can talk about that. But why don't they immigrate to Eastern Europe? Is it the economy or what?
There are a number of reasons. The economy, as you mentioned, is one of the most important reasons. Second, the language. Speaking about Hungary, where are we now? It's quite a challenge to learn the Hungarian language.
That's an understatement.
Yeah. And the most important reason, there are no established migrant communities in Central Eastern Europe. And those who travel to Europe, to Western Europe, they already have family, friends, people they know there who already paved their way, or at least can provide with some advices for them how to travel. And there are very few people take the courage to be the first to arrive somewhere.
I see. Okay. Did Douglas Murray get anything wrong in The Strange Death of Europe?
I would say Douglas Murray's perspective is a very British one, and as I believe he puts too much emphasis on the Islamic factor again. Well, we shouldn't equate mass migration and cultural differences between migrant communities with Muslims. Of course, because the Muslim community, so first of all, when we're talking about Islam and Europe, we are talking on the abstract level, because there's no such thing like Islam and Europe. Because first of all, Europe is made up of nation states with very different cultural traditions, very different definitions of nation. For example, you can be British and belong to any nationality, any religion. When it gets to Germany, to being German, it always, throughout history, was connected somehow to ethnicity. And now there's an ongoing process to renegotiate what does it mean to be German. So once a Muslim or a non-European migrant arrives to these countries, the whole environment is different. In every country, the environment is different. And secondly, we shouldn't regard Muslims as a homogeneous block of people, because it's extremely fragmented. They don't have a single political voice. They don't have a single identity. And if you read the researchers about Muslim communities or engage in dialogues in shisha bars with Muslims or anywhere in your workplace, you see that their identities are multi-layered. And religion is only one layer of the identity, and mostly not the most important one. Like, see, for example, in Germany in 2015, when there was this huge wave of mass migration and refugee crisis, there were polls among Germans, ethnic Germans and ethnic Turks. How do they regard the newcomers and the whole issue of mass migration? And the Turks refused mass migration from Muslim countries. So they refused the migration of their fellow Muslims in a larger number than the ethnic Germans, for the very reason that being Turkish is an important layer of their identity. And they cannot feel sympathy for an Arab, an Afghan, not to say a Kurd, arriving to their country and probably being their economic competitor in the same market. If you take a look on the parties, like the Muslim parties of Europe, you see that every year we hear about new Muslim parties established. But usually they don't succeed. They don't even get like 1% of the Muslim vote because from the outside, we look on them as Muslim parties. But if you are Muslim, you take a look on them and say, okay, what background does this guy have? Who launched the party? He probably had some economic interest, or probably he's a good guy. He's a fellow Muslim, but what can he provide? Why not vote socialists or the Greens? Because they can provide electricity, better welfare, whatever. So the Muslims are very hard to mobilize politically in Europe. And those who claim to speak in the name of Islam are usually the minority. And those who don't really have a social base.
Okay, so what percentage of all migrants, either legal or illegal or both, to Western Europe should we be worried about? Like 1%, 50%, 20%, a tenth of a percent, 90%, what percent?
It's very hard to say again, and it's any sort of mass migration can cause conflicts. Like, for example, in Hungary, there are lots of millions of ethnic Hungarians living outside Hungary.
Correct.
Because of the Trianon Treaty in the early 20th century, so they are living in Romania, Slovakia, so on. When socialism fall in Hungary in 1990, there were a huge wave of ethnic Hungarians from Transylvania arriving to Hungary, and the tensions in society rose because they were economic competitors. But certainly those tensions eased after then because they were like speaking the same language. There were like no culture or very little cultural differences. But the larger the cultural differences are, the larger the problem is. So I cannot say what percentage should be worried about. So certainly Germany is strong enough economically, socially to handle like 10,000 newcomers every year, but not millions.
Are the cultural differences too large to manage?
I believe so. When it gets to masses, when it gets to individuals, that's a very different question. So if you take a look in Hungary, where no established communities from the Muslim world, you see that everybody who arrived here had to learn the language, and many of them, like my father, he was married Hungarian, so became part of the society. But the issue would have been very different if there would be like already settled communities.
Okay, I want to go back to this question of what percentage of migrants should we be worried about? So I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it would seem to me the way I think about it, it's like concentric circles. You have some people we can clearly agree are a problem. Like if you look at, you mentioned the percentage of the prison inmates and where they're from and the breakdown there in Denmark, the UK, any place in Western Europe, and I'd put the UK in that basket. Those percentages are far higher. And so one of the ways that we get data, we corroborate data, is we ask, for example, the victims of rape, tell me about your assailant. And then we match those with the criminogenic factors, and we match those with people who are in prison. So clearly there must be some numbers there. We must have those numbers. Eric Kaufman's a friend of the show. He's been on the show. He's talked about those numbers specifically with Somalis in Denmark and in the UK. And we can also look at the numbers for the concentric circles, people who contribute to the treasury and take away from the treasury, where they're from, what characteristics they have.
But by the way, so I cannot tell you exact numbers in this one because there are no exact numbers and very little reliable statistics.
But we have inexact numbers. So for example, we know, that's why I asked you what percentage of the people from foreign countries least do we have not to worry about at all? And as a general rule, that we don't have to worry at all about the Japanese, like zero. Like they contribute to the net contributors across cultures to the treasury. Their incarceration rates are extremely low. It could be because of what you said before about masculinity. I'm not interested in the causal factors for that, but just it seems that there must be some, maybe not definitive answers to the question, but there must be some really good indicators of the percentage of people we have to worry about.
Again, we have to get back to the issue of social class. So if take a look on like the Iranian migration to Germany, you see that more 100,000 people of Iranian background, Muslim people, are residing in Germany. However, most of them were already the elite of their country who left after the Islamic Revolution. So yeah, there can be 100,000 of them, but they are willing to integrate and ready to integrate because of their educational level and social class. If we take a look on other communities with lesser education, then even having 100 of them can be problematic. But by the way, when it gets to Europe, we are putting so much, too much emphasis on the numbers and less emphasis on the legal status, because take a look and the way the laws are applied in a country. Take a look on Singapore, so like more than 40% are foreigners. Take a look on Qatar, like 80% are foreigners. The Emirates are the same, but probably there's no concern about criminality.
Well, we know why that's the case in Singapore.
Yeah. So the laws are applied regardless somebody's a citizen or a foreigner. The laws are applied.
Harsh, draconian, severe, strict laws.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter what color your skin is. It doesn't matter what your religion is. If you break the law in Singapore, you've broken the law.
Yeah. If the criminals are punished, then probably that's way of the solution. And if you see if the criminals are punished, it's a good message for those who are integrated and willing to integrate. And the other thing is the issue of citizenship. So the 80% of foreigners in the Emirates very likely will never have citizenship, and it's very clear why they are there: to make money. So once their contract is over, they can travel back. They collected a huge amount of money. However, the problem is in Europe is that a huge number of people who were not on a certain level of integration got citizenship, which makes problems.
Okay, so I have two questions. The first is, what is it about social class that leads to certain violent crimes? You mentioned social class a few times. Talk me through that, or talk me through it.
So how social class is related to violent crimes?
In terms of migration in Europe.
You see that in the case of the Netherlands again, it's not the Moroccans who are committing crimes in general, but certain groups of the Moroccans who came from certain parts of Morocco. And to be honest, it's a well-documented fact that back in the 70s and the 80s, the Moroccan government had a specific plan to send some problematic people to Europe because they simply just wanted to get rid of the potential rebels in the Berber areas. And some of them were already like families and extended families working in the hashish business back in Morocco. And when the Netherlands and Morocco signed a guest worker treaty, the Moroccan government was very happy to send some of the troublemakers to Europe. In Turkey, you see as well that in Anatolia, for example, these were impoverished regions traditionally, and many of the guest workers from this region went to Germany to work there. And of course, if somebody never been to a large city in his life, not to mention Europe, it's much harder to adapt. It doesn't mean, for example, that the Turkish community at this point is not quite well integrated to Germany. But certainly it means that those who come from less advantaged social classes are struggling more to make their life or find their path in Europe.
So this is about culture mostly.
I would say class and culture mostly, yes.
So getting back to something that you said before, are migrants who commit crime sufficiently punished in Western Europe? Because we had that conversation about Singapore. Are migrants who commit crimes sufficiently punished?
Well, it's not up to me to say. It's up to the specific national state. So every national state has its own tradition when it gets to the laws and the punishments.
I'm not sure that's true, though.
Well, I would say...
What about the grooming gangs in England? They got off because they were dark and Muslim.
Well, this is also an interesting question. So you can frame the grooming gang in the UK as Muslim grooming gang if you want to frame the whole issue in a religious frame.
Or a racial frame is the way they framed it.
Well, actually, if you take a look, some of the grooming gangs were run by Sikh people. Sikh people.
Oh, Sikhs.
Sikhs, yeah.
Oh, Sikhs.
And also, if you take a look on the construction of this grooming gang, you see that, for example, there was one taxi company operated by a Sikh guy who were employing people from the Indian subcontinent, not only from Pakistan or India, Bangladesh, from all around. So it certainly was a specific social group, but I won't say like a Muslim grooming gang, because these people were basically not following the principles of Islam when it gets to alcohol consumption, drug consumption, or any other issues. So of course they were culturally Muslim people. They were Muslim people from countries of Muslim majorities, but framing this as a Muslim issue, I think it's probably, I would say, it's the political correct way of the right to frame the issue.
Okay. What would be the best label to categorize these individuals? All of them. What would be the best label we could use?
Again, it's a complicated question because of specific traditions in specific countries. In the UK, it's okay to label them by ethnicity or racial background, because if you applied for a job, you can X which racial background you're from. In France, that's more problematic.
Yeah, like the grooming gangs. What would be the best label of, like, how would we categorize the people engaged in this behavior? What would be the best label we could use?
So it's hard to categorize because you will unintentionally hurt other people who are already well integrated and have nothing to do with this whole disgusting issue. So I would say you can frame them as Muslim, you can frame them as Pakistanis, you can frame them as like Indian people from the Indian subcontinent, but you will hurt people. You will hurt certain group of people who already are part of the society. So you should definitely frame it somehow, but certainly it's a tough question.
Okay, so expanding the umbrella a little bit and looking at this, do you find recently that attitudes have shifted in Western Europe in particular against immigration?
I definitely see so. This is the reason why the mainstream politics is trying to put a barrier in front of irregular mass migration. Yes, so I definitely see this, and it's not, as I mentioned before, not the left and right issue anymore. It's like a whole concern in the society, including the migrant communities. So a few months ago, I've been to Sweden and I visited some of the migrant neighborhood in Stockholm, and most who were complaining about the impact and criminality which is there in their societies were migrants themselves. I talked to a young Syrian guy who fled war.
It's the same thing in the United States, by the way.
Yeah. Because, these criminals are giving them a bad name. And once you try to do your best to fit the society and you see other peoples are causing all these troubles, you are obviously upset. And most of the criminal activities are affecting the criminal neighborhood. So they're recruiting young immigrants for their criminal activity, which is also causes like a generational tension.
Yeah, I think that's right. There was just a video released by, you know who Conor McGregor is? His coach is this guy, John Kavanagh, who's a great guy from Ireland. And he released a video of one of his students, I think he was a purple belt, who intervened in an assault against a woman. And he intervened against someone who was clearly not, it was in Ireland, Irish. And the response to that could certainly be, well, this is going to harm immigrants. But the response to that could also be immigrants, like a kind of stereotype threat. The response to that could also be, we need to be honest about the kinds of people we're taking into the country. You can say it on social class, you can say it on religion, you could say, and these individuals are disproportionately affecting crime, murder rates, although minuscule by comparison to the United States, minuscule, and rape rates. And just as an aside, I remember years ago I was on tour in Australia, and I have a friend there who's a politician, and I went to a meeting, and the meeting was in people from North Africa who had committed violent crimes and the murder rate, and it was in Melbourne. And I'm sitting in this meeting. It was very interesting as an American to be invited to this meeting. And I just kept looking at this data, and I kept saying, like, this could not possibly be right. I don't even understand why this is a problem. What's the problem? I thought they missed a zero in the number. But the murder rates are just so low there compared to what I'm used to seeing in the murder rate. It was just, literally, I thought there was a mistake. Like, I couldn't understand why people think that this is a problem. But it's a cross-cultural, like you said, Douglas Murray had a English lens. I think sometimes I have an American lens when I look at problems like that. But it is interesting because on one side of and I do think you're right. I don't think it's a right-left issue. I do think that the right categorizes things like after 9/11, the right's criticism of Bush was that he visited mosques and he tried to, say not all Muslims, et cetera. And the criticism from the other side is not being honest about the kinds of people who are committing these problems. And I think you have those two frames and those two lenses that make an honest conversation about the problem very important, because one group of people doesn't want to identify the perpetrators, and they're also justifiably concerned that if they do identify the perpetrators, large groups of people who are living in their country who abhor this behavior themselves will be smeared by the same brush. Mm-hmm. So it makes it very difficult to speak honestly about the problem, because people will go to crazy town and think, well, all Muslims or all immigrants, which it's clearly false. That's why I'd ask you, like, what percentage of the people do we have to be concerned with? But another thing, so you wrote, you wrote a novel, Allah's Spacious Earth. Tell us about that, and how does that relate to the conversation?
Well, back in 2015, this huge debate emerged, especially here in Hungary, about mass migration and Islam in Europe, and basically there were ongoing tendencies in the West. So the whole discourse about migration became very much Islamized in the Western countries, and there still is this fear that the Muslims will once overtake Europe. However, I don't really agree with this. First of all, as mentioned before, the Muslims are extremely fragmented. There's no Mr. Islam who you can talk to. The Muslims are like the Protestants in this regard. So they are locally organized. They act independently. They are very hard to mobilize. And if you take a look on their discourses on social media, some specific groups hate each other so much. So it's very hard to unify them. So never ever in Europe's history it happened that an unorganized, heterogeneous minority could take over. What happened in Europe, however, that the majority societies, the tension rose, and the majority societies produced politicians who were quite harsh for the minorities. So what I believe, what we see now, that Europe is still trying to maintain its Europeanness, and it's not the radicals who are taking power, but the mainstream is becoming more hostile to put it that way, to Islam in general. And if you take the lesson from history, you see that it's very likely that a lot of innocent people might suffer if the tensions will grow and grow. So basically my book is a social dystopia in which I try to show how in a fictional European country, which is basically a mashup of Sweden, the Netherlands, Belgium, Austria, Germany, a little bit UK, so how the political tensions can grow and how society will provide the authority for the mainstream to solve a problem which they regard as a problem, and how it affects the minority.
So I've predicted that at least one, probably more countries in Europe will fall to Islam by the end of the century. You think that's crazy?
I don't really think Europe might fall to Islam because, first of all, By demography, yes, certainly the number of people of Muslim backgrounds are increasing, and especially as mass migration is ongoing, there is a supply of people who are not socialized in Western societies.
And the other one's decreasing.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. But still, if you see and take a look on the Muslim discourses in Europe, you see that there's a huger fear of losing religion than like in Western societies, because lots of Muslims became cultural Muslims, and of course, when a terrorist attack happens, we are talking about those who are radicalized, but certainly we don't regard those as a part of the problem who lost their religion, who are going to work and drink a beer at night and watch Netflix.
Of course, they're not
because they are Westernized in this aspect. Still, culturally speaking, they are Muslims. Some of them are more integrated or less, but these people are not very much willing to vote for an Islamist regime in Europe, and especially because the Muslims are made up of a lot of ethnicities, a lot of religious sects and approaches and religious schools, and there's the internet, so one can belong to a community which is not physically connected to. So what I see is that an unorganized, heterogeneous minority cannot overcome organized system. And Europe, is strong. Okay, we regard Europe as weak, but I think it tells more about our perceptions and our fears than the actual state of Europe. So still, Europe is the best part of the world, especially if you travel to sub-Saharan Africa or the Middle East or anywhere. And I think Europe has a lot of resources. Certainly, demography is a problem. So Europe is in a demographic decline, and this is certainly something to be addressed.
So will European culture secularize Muslim migrants more than the migrants will Islamicize native Europeans?
Take a look on the numbers. How many Europeans are converted to Islam? You see, probably 10,000 or 30,000, or not that much, basically. Because, by the way, many of the converts are the extremes, because they had a hard way to find their new identity, and they found the extremes. However, I don't really think that the Western way of life could be affected to a certain by Islam in this way.
Is that number commensurate with the number of Muslim migrants who go in? Will the number of converts increase?
The thing is that certainly Muslim migrants, or I would say non-European migrants, because when it gets to sub-Saharan Christians, you also see that the fertility rate is higher than the European. And of course, for Muslim countries, the fertility rate is higher. But again, it's not only an issue of religion. It's an issue of culture. And according to the statistics, those who are already born in Europe, like second and third generation migrants, they're not having as much babies as the previous generations, because it's all about the social construction and how easy to raise a child. It's much easier to raise a child in Morocco than in Saint-Denis in Paris. But what makes the Muslim population increase is definitely the migration and the uncontrolled mass migration. Again, we have to address the issue of citizenship. So as we saw in many Arab countries, rich Arab countries, the huge numbers of foreign diasporas and communities are not posing a threat to the national culture and nothing, because they don't have citizenship. They're not going to have citizenship in the future. So if Europe makes it harder to have citizenship than before, and basically this is what we see. So in the case of Germany or in Sweden, before 2015, it was quite easy to have asylum there. Now it's mostly about a temporary protection, which is good for 2 years. Then they decide if they renew it or not. But it's definitely a bit harder to be settled down in this temporary situation. So I believe that it's not only the numbers; it's about the citizenship.
Okay.
And yeah.
So what should the rate of migration be in Europe?
It depends what kind of migration. If we talk about irregular migration, I would say zero. If we talk about regulated migration, I would say as much as the societies and economics demand. So,
Oh,
if
illegal migration should be zero.
yeah, definitely, because the rule of law should be applied in every country. If when it gets to the economic migration or the controlled economic migration, and control, that's the most important point in this regard, it should be as much as the society's demand and the economy's demand. But the most important thing is that the authorities should keep things in hand. Like, it's like crazy. Like in France, for example, you have between 700,000 and 1 million sans-papiers people who should leave France, but the authorities don't know nothing about their whereabouts. So that this is something that shouldn't happen in Europe.
So how many more migrants, for example, could Germany take or France take or the UK take? Could they take millions more, 100,000 more, no more?
I believe in the short term, there are already quite large tensions in these societies. And in order to ease these tensions and make the public trust again in their governments and authorities, the numbers should decrease at this moment, and there should be more emphasis on the integration of those who are already there and to send back who are not eligible to be in these countries.
Yeah, so I think it was Matt Goodwin suggested on the show a temporary ban on migration, a period ban, like a 2-year ban, and we do exactly what you just said. We focus on, I don't know if providing resources would be the right way to say it, but ultimately it has to come down to some kind of resource distribution where you help people integrate into the society. To do that, you would need certain laws. I remember in reading something in the UK, there are schools in which individuals in the society have pressured teachers to wear headscarves because there are Muslim students in the school. These are British schools. And I remember when Reed and I were in London, we walked by a church, and in the church parking lot, we saw Muslims praying, not the parking lot, like on the grass, outside the church. We saw Muslims praying there. And just to be clear with you, I'm an atheist. So I'm not gung-ho on Christianity or Judaism or Islam or anything. And I just found that to be astonishingly disrespectful. But maybe it's just my lens as an atheist looking at, like, I would never, I don't pray, so I can't really think of the analogy, but it does seem to me that we have a minority of people, and again, I do say it is a minority of people, who do not respect the norms of the culture. And that creates friction, not only in the culture, but among the people who actually do abide by the norms in the culture. And so it's unclear to me how the society should navigate that other than a moratorium on immigration until we figure this problem out.
Yeah, what you mentioned, this is a really great problem, especially in the age of social media, because the radicals and the tiny minorities who disturb the social order and don't respect the culture are given a big voice. So let's mention the so-called Sharia patrols issue in the UK.
Yes,
So there were like a handful of cases. They were like some guy going on and making videos, uploading it on YouTube. But we are talking about like a handful of people harassing the locals, regardless of their ethnicity or background. They were harassing people who, according to their interpretation, were not applying like the morals. But still, in the anti-Muslim discourse, we hear that there are Sharia patrols in Europe. Well, basically, that's a media hack. And it used to be a media hack. And in Germany, when it happened, the authorities just arrested the guy. So, but still, their voice are now heard, these people. And they are giving the whole Muslim community a bad name.
Okay, so here's something, maybe you can help me understand this. So I have a lot of Jewish friends, a disproportionate number of Jewish friends. And they've told me, and this is also in the United States, it's not merely in Western Europe. They've told me that one person I just spoke to the other day, I won't mention his name because he moves in the public space, told me that he was on a train and someone recognized him and they started yelling Jew at him. Is it a concern that an increase in Muslim migration will lead Jewish people to be concerned for their safety? Is that something that, in your opinion, we need to be worried about?
Well, I can understand certainly the concern of the Jewish communities all around Europe because of the increasing violence. If you take, but still, if you take a look on the other side, we see a discourse within the Muslim communities, a discourse of fear about the rise of what they call Islamophobia. So certainly, all the concerns of minorities should be addressed, and the European government shouldn't allow its Jewish citizens to be harassed, especially not on a religious or ethnic or any other basis. Again, I'm not exactly sure here if certainly this is true that there is a very strong anti-Jewish or anti-Semitic sentiment among certain groups of young Muslim people.
For sure.
Absolutely.
Unarguable.
Yeah, that's right. Still, if you take a look on the roots of this kind of stereotypes and negative stereotypes, we see that it's a huge mess. So it's not certainly some of them are rooted in religious texts of Islam. But again, if you take a look on the Quran and the hadith, the prophetic hadiths, these narrations of Prophet Muhammad, we see that there are more positive narrations on Banu Israel or the Jews than negative ones. And if somebody wants, like an imam, wants to explain to its people why you should be friends with Jews, he has lots of sources to refer to. And basically, this is what they're doing now in the Emirates when they're making peace with Israel. They're referring in the Quran and the Hadith to the examples, like with Prophet Muhammad when he was he was slaughtering a sheep. He provided meat for the Jewish neighbors, and he had alliance with Jewish tribes, and everything was fine. If you take a look on Hamas's discourse or the Iranian discourse, you see that they're highlighting the parts when Muhammad had enmity with 3 Jewish clans of Medina, or the Khaybars, who were basically, it was a conflict of political nature, but still, as it's reinterpreted now, it's a religious one. But also this actual perceptions of some of the Muslim migrants about Jews come from the old European anti-Semitic literature. So in the Middle East, for example, you see that in the late 19th century, there were missionary schools, mostly run by French, and basically it was local Christian, like Arab Christian students who translated this French work, like, for example, the Protocol of Elders of Zion were first distributed by an Orthodox, by a newspaper run by an Orthodox Christian, and all this anti-Semitic discourse was established at that time in the Middle East. However, if you take a look on the medieval times, you see that while Europe was keeping the Jews in ghettos and intellectual ghettos and physical ghettos, in the Muslim empires, they had quite good social place, and there was an interaction between Muslim communities. And Maimonides, the great Jewish philosopher, even said that a Jew and Muslim can go to each other place of worship because Yahweh and Allah are the same. So it usually is, it's all about politics, but all these good examples are not read by those young, mostly Muslim males in Western societies who are doing these anti-Semitic acts.
For sure. And taking everything you just said and putting it in one basket. And this isn't just Europe, to be clear. I think it's a global phenomenon, but I don't know how prevalent it is in the East. It's certainly in the United States. We were in New York a while ago. People, I can't say who they were, but they were wearing Palestinian flags, were standing outside of Jewish delis, and there are videos of this online that people can see, and they were screaming at the Jewish patrons of this. And this is obviously unacceptable, doesn't even begin to describe what this is. It does seem to me to be crystal clear, and if there's a mistake in my reasoning, let me know. I accept everything you said in the basket of things that you just said. I accept it. I think it's historically, I accept it. And we are still faced with the problem of an increased Muslim minority in a community leads to direct problems for Jews.
Yeah.
I think that's blatantly obvious.
Yeah.
Okay, so you agree with that.
Yeah.
So then I guess the question becomes, I also agree with you that the government should do something about it. The police force should be doing something about it. But isn't a better way to address, as opposed to just asking people not to harass Jews, decreasing Muslim immigration? Won't that be I don't want to say it's a fix to the problem because it's not actually a fix to the problem, but wouldn't that be a reasonable solution to, Gad Saad talks about importing large numbers of people, and he's had this harassment because he's Jewish, not because of his ideas or who he supports politically. He doesn't like Trudeau, but because he's Jewish. Like, that's the cause of this. He suggested that we limit Muslim immigration from Muslim countries to potentially fix this problem.
I would say, well, again, when it gets to anti-Semitic attitudes or anti-Jewish attitude, okay, again, you can frame it as a Muslim problem, and certainly in Europe, you see that it's partly, especially the physically aggressive part, is a young male Muslim problem. But when it gets to religion, I'm not sure if the Syrian Christian community are less hostile to Israel than the Syrian Muslim communities, because you know that's, for example, in Syria, that's part of the Baathist or the national identity. That's the identity of the state to be against Israel. And basically, the minorities who are hardcore supporters of the regime, including the Christians, are sharing all these notions.
Okay.
But certainly, certainly I agree with you. First of all, I would say that the rule of law should be applied and no discrimination and nothing should be allowed regardless of race and ethnicity and nothing.
No, there's no argument there. Like, we are absolutely 100% agreeing on that. 100%. Categorical agreement. But the percentage of Syrian Christians who are causing problems for Jews, certainly in relation to the total number of Muslims who come in, must be trivial. And when you say that you can't pinpoint the problem, I mean, the problem is not coming from people from Vietnam who emigrate to Europe. They're not beating up Jews or screaming at my friend's face, "You Jew." And I'm not going to say what else this person said to my friend because it's so. I think we need to be honest that this is a problem, and we are seeing the kind of denial of the problem, but we also at the same time we don't want to overinflate the problem either. I mean, it sounds ridiculous to say, but there are no like internment camps for Jews.
Yeah.
But there are problems with Jews being harassed when they're eating, with Jews being harassed in university systems. And again, I'm not Jewish. I'm just saying this out of a deep concern for what I see as a canary in a coal mine and a problematic trend that I do not see getting better and that I only see getting worse as the number of young Muslim men increases in society. And the whole Middle East is a tinderbox right now. I see this problem in the Middle East having direct consequences for Jewish citizens and for Muslim citizens in a different way, like not for individual instances of violence or retribution for just walking along the streets.
Yeah, I can agree with you.
Yeah.
On this one.
Okay, so if you had a wand, if I gave you a magic wand and you could wave the wand, what would you do in terms of policy prescriptions for migration in Europe? What laws would you have a wand? What do you do with the wand? Does Brussels change the laws? What do you do? You have three waves.
Wow. Again, it's a tough question to answer. Obviously, I would say stop irregular migration.
Illegal migration.
Yeah, stop illegal migration and work on work on the integration of the people who are already here. Yeah, but what I see now, it's not.
Let's go back to your second point. So what does that mean? What does that look like to work on that? Like what would you do with the wand? How do you help those people integrate?
It depends on each country. So first of all, I believe the language is very important. It's the most important factor to integrate the society, to make laws clear. So what is allowed, what isn't allowed, and to be punishment for those who don't want to apply the laws. However, magic, I'm afraid, doesn't really work. So we have to work with realities in this regard, and it's not in the hands of Brussels, as we see. It's mostly in the hands of the nation states now in Europe. And as we see, there this migration pact of Brussels, which was enforced recently. But I see that the nation states are not waiting until these 2 years until it's implemented. They are taking the issue in their own hand.
So in London, the people are extremely well integrated in terms of linguistic integration. And even Tony Blair, who's a staunch advocate of more immigration, has admitted that we need to be honest about the problems with a minority. Again, we're talking about a minority of Muslims. But in that case, it's not a linguistic problem because they speak the language. So there is so how do you help those people integrate to the values of the host society?
It's a problem. So there's a not when you get to the values of the host societies, how would you define the values of the host society? So there's no consensus, not even on the European side.
I'll give you a few values, like not beating up homosexuals when they walk down the street.
When it gets to beating up homosexuals, I'm afraid it happens in Christian Moscow as well, or and pogroms against homosexuals happen in Christian Uganda as well.
100%.
Yeah. So
that same rule applies not just to Muslim immigrants, but to anybody who wants to beat up homosexuals.
And in the US, for example, you see that the community the most hostile against homosexuals are the Black community. So I would say it's not a Muslim issue; it's a cultural issue again. And the rule of law should be applied, so nobody should be harmed, and nobody should be allowed to be harmed because of sexual, ethnic, religious background.
Yeah. So we agree on that. It just and I think the data bears out what you said. That's true. There are anti-gay attitudes prevalent in the Black community, which, by the way, the left does not want to talk about. But even there, we're not talking about Black people murdering homosexuals or beating them up in even remotely the same proportions that we see, for example, in the Netherlands. There's another example of homosexuals being beaten up. It does seem that we need to bring, like, if I had the data on this, it would be great. Like, it's not just attitudes against homosexuality, which of course these are prevalent in certain Christian communities. There's no question in certain minority communities. It's that many homosexuals, and again, I'm maybe I have a dog in the fight because both of my kids are gay, but many homosexuals fear walking hand in hand in Western Europe, and it's not the right-wing parties that they're afraid of.
Yeah.
They're afraid of Muslim immigrants.
Yeah, that's right. So this is one of the reasons Marine Le Pen has a strong basis in the gay community in France.
Correct.
So yeah, that's absolutely right.
Yeah, or Pime Fortune, or Geert Wilders, or So I don't know. It's refreshing for me to hear you say that, because I think it's very honest to be. You're honest about the nature of the problem. I think it's incredibly important to be honest about the nature of the problem. I don't know, other than a moratorium on all migration. I don't know. I'm not an economist. I don't know the impact that would have on the economies. My feeling, well, my feelings are completely irrelevant to what the facts are. Is there anything individuals in Western Europe could do, or Americans could do, to help ameliorate the suffering, to fix the problem? What can we do to kind of heal some of these divides or fix the problem more generally?
I believe we should fix our own lives and basically just live our lives as Western people and uphold the Western values, which means, and it's a very important and a great treasure in Western culture, that we are measuring and judging somebody as an individual, not as a member of the society or not a member of a certain group. So I believe like being open to other people will definitely help the integration of those people who are willing to integrate. And certainly we should vote for politicians who are willing to apply the rule of law and who are willing to protect the societies. And of course, what we should do also as Westerners, just to keep this debate going and not try not to not to keep the taboos as they are, because we need to face the problems and we need to engage in discussions.
I keep thinking about like, what can we build? What can we create? What can we make? What can we do with people who have different beliefs or ideas or ideologies to bring us together, to make us realize like, okay, we have something common here. Maybe it's something. Sometimes I see all the trash in the Danube there, and I think, wow, this would be a great project. If I lived here, you know what I would do if I lived here? If I lived here, I would get together schools. I'd put a curriculum in the schools to give kids extra credit for volunteering to clean trash, and I would bring them through the whole process of this is how you recycle. I have them write a paper about it, but I don't live here. But if I lived here, that would be one of my projects. So I'm telling you this for a reason. The reason I'm telling you this is, Reed's gonna have a heart attack when I say this, but so I do jujitsu very seriously. I love jujitsu. It's like, you know what that is? It's like wrestling. Okay. So I was in London at Hardra Gracie's studio. And it is a very high level competitive studio. And when you're engaged in this kind of activity, you have to trust the people you're working with. It is non-negotiable. And so what the communities, in this sense, that word community is overused, but in this sense, it's the perfect word. What the communities do is they have rituals, and that those rituals are meant to promote trust among people and camaraderie. So, for example, the studio where Reed and I go here, they have many rituals. One of the rituals they have is that when someone enters, regardless if they know you or not, they give you a handshake, one of these handshakes. Okay. So that everybody, every time, right, Reed? Every time sometimes they do it to Reed, they do it to me, I do it to people. They did it to me when they didn't even know me. Now they know me quite well. So they have rituals that they make to solidify things in the community. I'm telling you this story because I think that this demonstrates in a very real way the difficulty of the problem we're up against. So there's a woman there at the studio who is a purple belt in jiu-jitsu. That's pretty advanced. That takes years and years to get, of like grueling work. However, this woman refuses to do anything that involves touching a man. She's Muslim. So, for example, and I'm not talking wrestling, I'm talking even touching. So she opts out of all the bonding rituals of the people in the community, like the slapping hands, and any touching, anything that involves touching. And I think that's wrong. And I think it's wrong for two reasons. One, because there is a woman's class. And so nobody's forcing her to go to the men's class. She could easily go to the women's class. But the other reason that I think that's wrong, and so why I'm mentioning it to you now, is because I think if people do not participate, because you said, well, what is culture? Well, this is an example of culture. If people do not participate in binding and bonding community rituals, that undermines the cohesion of the whole community. And it casts them by their own choosing as an other. Now, I've asked a lot of people who run jiu-jitsu studios what they think of this. And again, you can look at this through many lenses. which is also why I think that the story can help us here. One, you can look at it as through a capitalist lens. You can say, well, the person owns the gym. We live in a capitalist economy. They're paying money. If they don't want to participate in the rituals, it's my gym. The state can't come in and tell me. I'm not going to let them participate in the ritual. They can opt out. That's fine. If your lens is a capitalist lens. If you have another lens, again, it depends on how you look at the problem. But there's just no question about it that undermines the communal aspect of an activity in which you have to trust people. You have to trust that they will not break your arm. You just have to. So I'm wondering, is this at all analogous to the problem in which we find ourselves now, in which there are some people who want to opt out of the conventions, the cultures, and the customs, and that creates a kind of othering. That creates a kind of distance among, and even I would go so far as to say even an emotional distance at the way we look at people who do not subscribe to those bonding rituals.
Well, I believe it's the host community's duty to define these rituals first. However, what we see now is an ongoing identity crisis and an ongoing attempt to renegotiate. What does it mean to be European? What does it mean to be British, to German, to French, and to France, and so on? So in these circumstances, it's very hard to define what laws and what rituals should the newcomers apply. If the laws are set, then it's quite an easy thing. If you take back, if all the migration happens in a country with a set of values, then it's an easy thing. However, in this time of identity crisis, I believe it's quite a challenge.
Yeah, I
so
agree.
how would you define?
Yeah, I agree.
Can you tell me, how would you define what does it mean to be European? Okay, I understand not to beat up gay people. I agree. Completely. Not to harm Jewish people. I completely agree.
I'm much better. I'm much more comfortable
still.
answering the question, what does it mean to be American, than I am to be European, because I'm not European. So
Yeah.
I don't really know, frankly, what it means to be European.
That's a problem, that there's an ongoing discussion on this. So there's no consensus on the issue. Is being Christian necessary to be European? So what we see now, that it's an emerging discussion that European means not being Muslim. But still, what does it mean? So if the specific European nations can set their they set their terms and set their rituals and name what are the most important rituals, that's important. But what we see in Brussels, for example, in Brussels at Christmas time, it's not the local Moroccan communities who are demanding the removal of the Christmas tree, but it's basically the bureaucrats of Brussels who are not Muslims. And this is a very symbolic thing. So if you go to Qatar, you go to Kuwait at Christmas time, or go to Egypt, you see at the mall Christmas trees in Muslim countries. However, they are upsetting some basically Western people in the West. So,
okay, so I think your question is a really good one, and I'm going to take a stab at it. Because I thought you were going to say, okay, what does it mean to be an American? Which is, I'm much more capable of answering that. I think that the question of what it means to be a European is not the right question. I think the question is, what does it mean to be insert country, an Austrian?
That's right.
What does it mean to be Hungarian? Or what does it mean to be Italian? I think it's easier to give that because the emergence of European identity is a fairly recent phenomenon. Again, so I would think that it would be a tradition, a language. I would think that it would be a certain kind of, again, it depends on the country.
Yeah, that's right.
It depends on the country.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. But the debates are ongoing on the country levels, and these debates are not set yet. So I believe this should be step number one to get back your previous question. So this should be the first thing to be done, to set the standards.
To make those clear. And so let's say that we set the standards and some people choose to opt out of those standards. I don't really have a problem with that depending on what standards they opt out of. Like, I'm trying to think if I find it totally reasonable if a guy wants to wear a dress. I couldn't care less if a guy wants to wear a dress. That's different than saying a guy who wears a dress wants to go into a woman's changing room. That I have a big problem with. So, or, you know, a man wants to hold hands with his boyfriend, or a woman wants to hold hands with her girlfriend, or even, you know, kiss or what have you, on a sidewalk or something. I have no problem with that. Actually, I have a lot of problem with people smoking cigarettes, but that's a conversation for another day. So I think that the society can be pluralistic and diverse enough to deal with a significant number of people. I don't want to say breaking culture or traditions, but kind of doing their own thing. But it's united around a set of ideas and values. And I think that those ideas and values are constitutive of what it means to be a member of that community. And I think if you think about it that way, and I think that's why the woman not slapping hands with everybody at the end was so disturbing to me, because it violated a norm, a value of camaraderie and trust in a way that a guy wearing a dress does not violate anything. He's just some dude wearing a dress. So
So here comes a question. So,
Yeah.
And it's again about the identity and the community values. Here in Central Eastern Europe, the people would raise an eyebrow definitely if somebody
100%.
would, if a man would wear a women's dress.
100%.
And it gets again to the question. So when it gets to the Muslim female dress, like the hijab, not to talk about the burqa or the niqab, because that's, well, wearing a burqa in Europe, or wearing a niqab, that's definitely a political statement. That's not a cultural statement.
100%.
Wearing a hijab, that can be cultural. So so this is one of the reasons the burqa is banned in many countries, or the niqab, but not the hijab.
I completely agree.
But still, here comes the question. So, is it okay if somebody walks in hijab in the country, in the streets of a Western city? And it's up to the local community to discuss this issue. Again, there's no common European ground on this.
As you know, liberty and liberté in France is different from that in Germany, and the traditions of secularism in France, for example.
Absolutely, yeah.
So we also want, in at least the way that I think of the issue is, that's why I think it's less helpful to look at it as European, the sense of identity and values, and more helpful to look at in terms of nation states.
Exactly.
So we want the countries to have a sense of sovereignty and the ability to make decisions that they think are in the best interest of their own citizens, and to kind of lead them by their own lights through the democratic process for what they want to aspire to for their country. And so it's a really interesting question. And I don't think this gets too far afield, but it's a really interesting question. What are the limits that the state should have on, for example, people wearing dresses, or people wearing? It's funny how we talk about these things in terms of cultural, sexual mores or values, burqas, because I do think that that's a political statement, and I think it's emblematic of a worldview, and that worldview is explicitly hostile to the very values and bedrock of the country, of the host country, whereas wearing a dress is no such thing.
Yeah.
So we have certain individuals who have inimical values and they demonstrate those values through their dress. I don't have a problem, for example, with a yarmulke, because it's not, for many reasons, but one, it's not a proselytizing religion. Two, it doesn't really make a kind of political statement in the way that a burqa. I mean, certainly a burqa, we would agree, that's quite the political statement. And I agree, you know, in Iran, for example, you can wear a headscarf, and that it's not necessarily a political statement. Or you can be from a Christian community and wear headscarves, and that's not necessarily a political a statement either. So I think it's complicated as the world becomes more integrated. We're attempting to navigate complex issues of sovereignty, of identity, of binding within the community, of respect, of values. And then superimposed on that, we have these economic considerations of are people taking our jobs, et cetera.
What makes it even more complicated is digital sphere.
Correct.
So now where previously we used to live in our own communities, physical communities. Now we are living in our digital villages and echo chambers, and it's very hard to find consensus in specific things. Let's take a look on October the 7th last year. So if you see the Western media and the Western echo chambers and social media, you saw all these horrible acts militants did.
Horrific,
So
yeah.
we saw these footages taken from body cams, from CCTV, from local Palestinians who were just posting these horrible acts. But if you take a step back and take a look on the other echo chambers. Like I wouldn't say the whole Muslim world because that's not unified, but I would say the pro-Palestinian digital echo chambers. Then the issue is very different. So you see that like footages issued by Hamas treating kids nice and giving milk to children.
Yeah, they're rocking the babies. I've seen those videos.
Like joking with elderly ladies, and even you see there was like one testimony which was posted also on TRT, the Turkish news television, that one Israeli settler lady provided a testimony that a Hamas militant came to her home. He assured her that he's a Muslim and will not make any harm. Then asked very politely if he may take a banana from the table. He took the banana and left away. So basically, the whole narrative is extremely different, and I really can't see how a common narrative should be built around any important issue, because basically October the 7th was a very important issue and showed how diverse the Western public opinion is and how fragmented it is.
God, this is a conversation that we could continue for a long time, but we've hit our time limit of 90 minutes. Where can people find your work?
Well, mostly online. So basically, I have my academic papers and academic books available on on Google Scholar, and I would say also the books are available online.
Excellent.